Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Henry Jeffries. Henry volunteered himself for this podcast, and I put out a call on Twitter, and I said, who am I going to interview next week? Because I found it all got a bit depressing, what with Douglas Murray on terrorism and Robert Toombs talking about how Paris is falling to bits and France is over, and well, actually that's my version, but it was a bit like that. And Henry has written, he's the antidote for this, and he's come along with a bottle of sherry. Henry, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I hope you don't mind me putting myself forward. I thought...
It was bloody brilliant. No, you have no idea. Doing these podcasts, they eat up material like nobody's business, and you get really desperate for, who am I going to do next week? And it's got to be somebody who's available. And you were
always available, yeah.
You were very happy to whore yourself, which is the first requirement.
Yeah.
And I knew you were going to be interesting because I've known you from a long time back, and I thought you were a nice chap.
It's been a long time, yeah. I think it's probably early noughties. I think when you were a hotshot young journalist and I was a bright young thing in publishing.
I know, and look what's happened to us.
I know.
It's terrible, isn't it?
If only the readers could see, the listeners could see how jaded we look.
How. In fact, let me correct you there, Henry. We talk to listener. The listener is our special friend.
Okay, listener.
Because otherwise, you see, the listener might feel, if we were to pluralise him or her, that we were being disloyal and we were being profligate with our...
Sorry, listeners.
Listener.
Sorry, listener.
Lovely special friend.
Yeah.
Now, what have you brought me? This sherry is very nice.
I brought Gonzalez Bias Tio Pepe Fino en Rama. And the idea is this is a special Fino sherry that tastes like sherry used to taste before they sort of filtered it and modernised it and things like that.
Who's they?
Well, just sherry producers. If you drink ordinary Tio Pepe, it's very, very nice, but it's quite a simple drink, whereas the idea is that it's straight out of the barrel. So this is how sherry would have tasted 100 years ago.
This is the sort of thing that, who would have drunk sherry like this? Would Graham... Are there any famous sherry drinkers?
Well, I think sherry was so ubiquitous that everybody was a famous sherry drinker. That was what you drank. For most of British history, wine was either claret, sherry, or port, and most people would have probably just would have had sherry.
We're talking about when?
Oh, from sort of the 17th century until the 1950s, 1960s. I mean, sort of sherry was wine. If you had a bottle of wine in the house, it was probably sherry.
So Graham Greene, Noel Coward, Evelyn Waugh.
Evelyn Waugh was a great sherry drinker, yeah. But he never really wrote about sherry because I think sherry was just too sort of everyday for him. So he wrote about, Dickem and Montrachet.
And also, Oxbridge Dons and such like, they would always serve sherry, wouldn't
Always
they?
would have had sherry,
Sherry,
yeah.
Vicar.
Well, that's why people had sherry. It's for when the vicar came over. So even people who didn't really drink wine would have had sherry in the house for when the vicar came over or the bank manager or someone important.
And is sherry, given that we've found our way to sherry, that we can cover the other boozes later on, but is one of the advantages of sherry that it can be drunk on its own or with tapas, I suppose?
Yeah, you could drink it with anything, but I think the success of sherry is partly down to the fact that there really wasn't that much competition. You didn't have kind of wines from the Loire, or you didn't have wines from New Zealand or anything like that. Sherry was a known quantity, and it travelled well, which was very important.
And it keeps well, doesn't it?
And it keeps well, yeah.
Am I right? Because I don't even keep my sherry in the fridge, and I use it mainly for cooking, and I keep it in my larder, and I leave the bottle open, I mean, obviously with the cork in, but I drink it sort of months after the event. Is that a bad thing?
Well, according to that is a bad thing, but it's not as bad a thing as it would be with any other wine, because sherry is made with a certain amount of oxygen. It's designed to be exposed to oxygen, especially a darker sherry. So this is a Fino sherry, and it's aged under yeast so that you don't get much oxygen. But something like an Oloroso, a dark sherry, that's aged with lots of oxygen. So there's not very much you can do to destroy it because it's already... And that's how wines used to be. They were made with oxygen contact, whereas nowadays, your sort of New Zealand wines and your sort of modern white wines, there's no oxygen. So as soon as they're exposed to oxygen, they start to deteriorate.
Well, how do you do that? How do you give them oxygen content?
Well, I mean, it wasn't something that they did deliberately. It's just the wines that you either drank wine very soon after it was made. So we sort of imagine your kind of 14th century wine drinker.
Yeah.
You'd have the harvest. You'd get the grapes. You'd smash them up. They would turn into wine. You'd sort of give it some sort of vague pressing to take the sort of matter off, and then immediately it would start to deteriorate. So then the thing that you would do is you try and drink it as quickly as possible, and by the next year it wasn't as good, and 2 years later it would have been awful. Whereas sherry is one of the few wines that actually gets better with oxygen contact, and same with Madeira, port, all those kind of great fortified wines. Oxygen actually brings out sort of nutty, interesting flavours rather than turning them to sort of rancid vinegar.
So apart from the fact that you were available and eager, the other reason you're here is, as I think our special listener may have guessed, you do know your shit about alcohol. And I knew you from the early days when you were just a humble publishing PR.
It was very humble.
And very humble. Yeah. and then you sort of, well, you found your métier as a drinks writer.
Yeah.
And you've written a brilliant book, which I recommend to everyone. It's really enjoyable. You've got a lovely light style. I mean, God knows, it must have been very frustrating being a publishing PR when you could write better than a lot of the people you represented.
Well, I mean, I wasn't going to say that, but what actually got quite frustrating is, I won't name any names here, but I'm sure the listener will not know what a publishing PR person does, but it's basically bothering the Spectator.
Bored journalists who kind of, they don't despise you, but
they kind of do, and they don't remember your name, or they think you're called Jemima, because they're all called Jemima. And you come up with ideas, so you'll say, Mr. Delingpole here is going to write an article about, how sofas are the in thing this year, and everyone's talking about sofas.
To publish his book, Sofas Are Us.
Yeah, exactly. There's sort of a short history of the world told through sofas. And that's what you do. And I kind of got to the stage where the author would then write the article and it would be absolutely terrible. Yeah. And you'd get a call from someone at the Telegraph going, this article's awful. I don't think we can run it. And I sort of thought, I can do this better. So, not in every case. Obviously, lots of writers are very good journalists as well, but a lot of writers aren't necessarily good journalists as well.
You don't need to be immodest here. I can do your immodesty for you. You do have a lovely light style. It's a very readable book, and your book is called Empire of Booze. What a great title. Yeah,
the title is it might be the best thing about it, and then the subtitle's pretty good as well. British History Through the Bottom of a Glass. And the cover, I think, is pretty good as well. It's a sort of, it was designed by an Indian lady who does Salman Rushdie's covers.
Yeah,
so it's got a sort of Bollywood.
It's got a masala kind of a red and sort of turmeric colouring. Yeah, it's good. But more to the point, it puts Britain. I think our American friend listening to this can also feel happy about this, because I think Americans really are like our children.
I think so. In fact, I was in New York, oddly, promoting the book, and the Americans are so into it. They love it, and they realise that it's their story as well.
It is their story.
Yeah.
I want to say this to Americans. You are our children, and we're very proud of you. and we are. And I think that Americans should be as proud of this book as a British person should be by its thesis, which is basically every drink that's worth drinking in the world was invented by the British, and that includes champagne, starting with champagne.
Yes. I mean,
tell us about that, because it's a great story.
Well, it's a sort of story in two halves, because champagne as a sparkling wine, what you need for that is you need very, very strong bottles, because it's fermented a second time in the bottle, which produces lots of bubbles. And
so it would explode, basically.
Well, until the 17th century, glass was like glass, like a decanter glass. It was very, very brittle, and you couldn't do very much with it. You certainly couldn't store it. You certainly couldn't produce bubbles in it, because it would just explode. And there was a 17th century chap called Sir Kenelm Digby, whose father was implicated in the gunpowder plot and drawn and quartered. So Digby was a bit of a cavalier. And he was also a scientist, and he experimented and came up with a new strong kind of glass, which was the furnaces were fired with charcoal rather than with wood. So you got a much higher temperature of glass melting, or whatever it's called. I'm not quite sure of of the sides, but you ended up with a very strong bottle. And then you had these members of the Royal Society. One of them was Sir Kenelm Digby, experimenting with bottle fermented ciders and wines. And there was papers given at the Royal Society saying, got some cider, put some sugar in it, put the cork in, the bottle exploded. Tried it again with less sugar, ended up with some bubbles. And there's lots of papers about this from the Royal Society.
So until the late 17th century, you could not get fizzy alcohol of any form at all.
Well, not deliberately. It might happen accidentally. So your wine in a cask might come over and then start re-fermenting, and you would get like a pétillant, like a vino verde. So you'd get little bubbles, but actually proper fizz you wouldn't have had until the 17th century.
Yeah. So if I was writing a book set in I don't know, Elizabethan times, and somebody quaffed some champagne, that would be
anachronistic.
Terribly anachronistic.
Yeah. So make
exactly.
a note of that.
Yeah. Sorry, carry on. So we started experimenting with fizzy drinks with cider,
and then they moved on to wine, and then probably, there is quite a bit of conjecture in the book, but probably what happened is that people noticed that wine from Champagne, was particularly nice sparkling. So they would ship it over in cask and then bottle it over here and then try and get it to fizz.
When are we talking now? What?
So this would be late 17th century.
Right.
And very quickly, the glass, which is still known in France as verre anglais, crossed the channel, and then the French started doing it. They started making their champagne deliberately sparkle. Whereas before it was considered a fault. Before, you would make the wine, and then the next year, when the weather warmed up, it started to fizz, you'd be like, oh no, we have a problem here.
Yes.
my French accent.
Exported to the English and charged ridiculous prices.
But very quickly, the French caught on, and so I'm not being too chauvinistic, the actual technology to turn it into a reliable and sort of industrially produced 2 million bottle Moet Chandon, that was Louis Pasteur, Veuve Clicquot, that was sort of French scientists perfecting it. The English kind of came up with the basics, but the French did perfect it.
Okay, but tell me, how do the French feel when you point out to them that basically there would be no champagne without us?
Most of them sort of accept it, I think. I think because they realise that all the sort of business of, as I've just said, making it a consistent product was them. And I don't think they really. I mean, a lot of them will give you the bullshit about Dom Perignon, the blind monk who made sparkling wine, which is almost certainly total bollocks. So you get that at Moet Chandon. But if you go to Paul Roger, who are a very sort of Anglophile
that was
champagne
Winston
house,
Churchill's favourite,
then they kind of admit that it was probably the English who got there first.
Right. That's good. Why is champagne so expensive?
Well, there's two reasons. Firstly, because they have built up.
That was my suspicion. Yeah,
over the years, it's brilliantly marketed. Most English people don't spend more than £6 on a bottle of wine, but champagne, £25, £30. People don't care.
You take the hit.
You just take it. But the method of production is expensive. So you have to make a still wine, then you have to put it in a bottle, then you have to add some yeast and a bit of sugar to it, then you have to bottle it, and you have to keep it for, I think, a minimum of 18 months. So you have capital tied up in maturing wine, and then the process then they have to take out. They do a thing where they turn the bottle very basically upside down, so all the yeast goes to the bottom. Then they have to open it, take the yeast out, recork it. So it's sort of, then that all used to be done by hand,
right?
And it's now mechanised, obviously. But the production historically was very expensive.
So in other words, it's a bit like compact discs. That actually now that it's mass produced pretty much, and the costs are minimal, and they go on making us pay through the nose.
I suppose the other thing is the land is very, very expensive in Champagne. So to grow the grapes do cost a fortune because they're so in demand. So the land is very expensive. The grapes are in demand. The best quality grapes cost more, and they charge a premium for them. So it's not it kind of there's two answers, because they can, but also it is probably the most expensive wine to make as well.
Is it a sign that I'm actually quite sophisticated, or is it a sign that I'm a spoil sport? That actually, I'm a bit meh about champagne, and if I think about the kind of, say, white Burgundy I could buy for the cost of a bottle of champagne, I'd rather have the Chassagne Montrachet or whatever any time than champagne.
No, that's a very not an unusual stance. And in fact, I used to be like that. And I suppose I'm very spoiled because I'm a wine writer, and so I'm often given very, very, very good quality champagne. But if you think of it like that, you would be much better off if you're thinking of amount of pleasure per pound.
Yeah.
You probably would be better off going to Bordeaux or Burgundy. But then sometimes you have like a vintage champagne, like a 2008 Paul Roger, is absolutely stunning. £80 a bottle. It's a lot of money, but I'd say almost worth the money.
I did actually, in my days as a jobbing diarist, I did once go to the Madame Boulanger Foundation lunch, and we had, I think, a 1935 vintage Bollinger, which was all right. I mean, I could drink that, but it's pretty quite pricey.
Probably quite pricey.
It's not too fizzy. I mean, one of my problems with champagne is it's too fizzy. Another one is it's a bit too acidic. It makes everyone's breath smell.
It does, and it's really bad for your teeth as well. If you go to Epinay and you come back and you think all you really want is like a light beer or something, because your teeth are just, it's agony.
Do you not think it's more of a girl's drink as well? Girls love champagne.
I think women do love champagne.
If you want to guarantee a shag, you just...
Do you know, I used to think that, but so many times it failed.
Oh, really?
I think, but there's something people just like it, and for someone like you used to be a diarist, so you used to get them free champagne. Yeah. I go to lunches and get free champagne, but for most people, it's like, wow, having champagne.
It's celebratory.
You're saying to your intended, your lady friend, you are important. We're having champagne, and this isn't Tesco's finest. This is Bollinger.
But that is the triumph of marketing over.
It is, yeah. No, it's like De Beers with diamonds. You now can't get engaged without spending however much on an engagement ring. The champagne has done that with wine.
I want to move on at some stage, perhaps now, to my favourite form of alcohol, because it's weaponised, and that is the cocktail.
Right.
I just think, I have been an aficionado of drugs in my time, and I would say the closest you get to a drug, to a sort of, Coke or whatever, is
a martini.
A white label, or a martini.
Yeah.
Martini. Did we invent those as well?
No, sadly not. That was the Americans. But we're going on this thing that the Americans are our children.
They're our children, yeah.
And it was gin. It was a London dry gin. Is the gin you use?
A martini is really just pure gin. Isn't
it? It's the apotheosis of gin. And I always say this to Americans. I say that you found the perfect use for gin, which is just drink it. Just get it really cold and drink it. Have you been to Duke's Hotel?
No.
The martini is wonderful. They keep the martini in the freezer. There's no messing around with cocktail shakers. They get the glass. They put a bit of Noilly Prat or something in, shake it around, go like that, flick it on the carpet, top it out with gin, bit of lemon, and I think it's like 6 shots, and you're not allowed more than 2. If you ask for a third, they won't give you one. And I've tried. And they are extraordinary, because you have one and it's just, it's like sinking into the most comfortable chair ever.
Yeah.
And then the second one,
like heroin, that is apparently.
Well, apparently. I mean, I've had morphine, which is pretty amazing.
I had morphine in hospital after my hunting accident. Just sidetracking here, and I have to say I was really disappointed, because what it did, it sort of takes you to another realm. You can still sort of see yourself in pain below, but you're sort of sideways from the pain. But what I didn't get was the kind of pleasure bit. I couldn't see why people take it for...
I can't really remember mine. I remember that was a very good description, because it was like the pain was a few rooms doors down, and you could still feel it.
Yeah.
But it was sort of distant. But it was... Yeah, it was very trippy. I remember just being completely off my head.
Yeah, there is that. But going back to martini, which I think is a much more practical form of getting out of it.
Yeah.
It's sociable in a way. It's available, and it's legal, for goodness sake. How is something that good legal?
Yeah, well, it just sometimes feels like it should be illegal. But no, the martinis are... And I have only very recently got into cocktails, and purely because people asked me to write about them. And I used to be a sort of... like you were a champagne skeptic. I was a cocktail skeptic. I thought they were sort of, Sex in the City and this sort of stuff.
The ones with horrible names are horrible.
Yeah, those sort of slow, comfortable screws and all
Yes.
those sort of innuendo cocktails.
Yes.
Which were awful, or are awful. But then people asked me to write about them, and I discovered things like, the Manhattan and the Negroni and, all those sort of kind of grown up golden age cocktails.
Do you not think that Negroni, of all the cocktails, is far too grown up? I mean, Campari is one of the most disgusting drinks ever, isn't it?
Oh, no, I love Campari.
Clearly, this is what happens when you... I had a similar effect when I became a music critic. I found that my tastes really broadened, so that I was going to drum and bass clubs to get into drum and bass in order to be able to understand drum and bass, which I didn't before. It just sounded like an awful lot of noise. Yeah. And suddenly I started enjoying that. In the same way, I imagine, as a drinks critic, you become... Or like somebody who's really into classical music and starts getting into different versions of the same piece of music and becomes a real connoisseur about conductors and stuff. You start getting esoteric tastes like disgusting bloody Campari.
Yeah, well, Campari. I mean, the bitterness is the sort of cliche of people in the
which it is. It's horrible.
The drinks business, especially the barmen. So they all like Fernet Branca. Have you ever had Fernet Branca?
That's medicinal.
It's medicine.
It's bitter medicinal, yeah.
And they drink it mixed with Coke in Argentina. Coca-Cola. I'm sure they probably mix it with cocaine as well. And that is horrible. But barmen love it because it's just that step further on the bitter scale.
I think we're going to carry on this cocktail conversation in a moment. First, I think we need a top up of our glasses. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest... increasingly drunk guest, I'm hoping, Henry Jeffries, author of Empire of Booze. More in a moment.
Check out the official Breitbart store today. Store.breitbart.com is the home for the brand new official Breitbart store. Head there now for products for women and men, like t-shirts, baseball tees, tank tops, hoodies, and hats, or an unapologetically American belt buckle. Store.breitbart.com has these items and many more. So get your gear now at store.breitbart.com. This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Henry Jeffries, author of Empire of Booze. Now, I'm getting sort of slowly getting there on the sherry.
Yep.
How much this sherry, this Tio Pepe that we're drinking, how much would it cost a bottle?
This is about £15. We should be drinking it ice cold. It would be better ice cold. But
don't think I hadn't noticed that.
But it's all right at sort of cool-ish. It's very nice. It's got Tio Pepe en rama, which sort of means from the cask or something like that.
Tell me, it's a bit like last week. Last week I had Professor Robert Toombs.
Oh yeah, he's good.
He's just fantastic. And what I'd really like, when I'm very, very rich, if it ever happens, I'm just going to have a sort of entourage of knowledgeable people, of experts, I suppose, so that I've got my historian coming round with me. Yeah. And obviously actually I know a number of historians, so I could have a posse of historians. But I was thinking, I need a wine guy, I need a drinks guy. So whenever I've got something I want to know about booze of any sort, be it a cocktail recipe or something to do with the history of wine, you could be my man.
I'll do it. Yeah, but you'd have to be very, very rich.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to be obscenely rich. Yeah. I don't know how it's going to happen. Cocktails. What would you say is your favourite cocktail?
Well, I think it's probably a martini.
I thought you said that.
I love a martini, but I do love those sort of like old fashioned and things like old fashions,
which is what a whiskey based one.
Yeah, whiskey ones as well.
Well, how many martinis is too many?
3 is too many. Two is just the right amount, and then 3. Just the whole evening. I mean, I the other day after my book won an award. And then we went to my wife and my publisher took me to Duke's Hotel, and I had 2 martinis, and then I had one more drink after that, and it was just yeah.
The last time I had 3 martinis was with my editor-in-chief at Breitbart, Alex Marlowe. He took me out for drinks. I mean, she's pretty cool when your editor-in-chief takes you out for like 3 martinis. I think that's a sign of the quality of a man. And the only bad thing he did was then he left me to my own devices when his wife came and picked him up. And I wandered into a clothes shop. Thing you don't want to do after 3 martinis is to wander in a clothes. It was like a trip, actually. I was sort of floating around, and I could see the sales assistants assessing me and thinking, do we approach this guy? He's completely rat-assed, or do we just leave him to his own devices? He's bound to buy something stupid. So don't go shopping after 3 martinis. Do you know my favourite cocktail? Probably is the White Lady.
Ooh, what's a White Lady?
Oh, White Lady. Do you not know? It's gin, triple sec or Cointreau,
Oh, yes.
and lemon juice.
Oh yeah, oh no, a bit of egg white.
Yeah.
Egg
white.
Yeah.
I sometimes skip the egg white. I sort of, it can survive without it.
Yeah, I know, I like those ones.
Or a margarita.
Yeah.
You can't argue with a margarita.
No, there's a very nice New Mexican place in Borough Market that's run by the Barafina people. You know,
Right.
The Barafina Tapas on Frith Street. I think it's Frith Street, or maybe Dean Street. But they've now opened a Mexican restaurant that does really good margaritas. Slightly off topic, but
No, that's good. It's good to know about these things. Do you believe that different spirits give different drunks?
I don't think so. I think they give different hangovers, though. I think brown spirits, and I think it's to do with the amount of impurities in them, give you monster hangovers. So I recently got quite into Armagnac, which is like cognac. But
I won't go there.
It's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. But then you get some horrible hangovers.
That's what I mean. I won't go there because of the hangovers. And so, would that apply to whiskey as well?
Yeah, sort of whiskey. I think almost like the better the whiskey, or the sort of older, the worse the hangover. So if you had like a Macallan 18-year-old, you're going to get a stinker off that.
Yeah, which is why my favourite drink is gin. You can't go wrong with gin.
No, and actually the next day after having my 2 martinis and another drink and having drunk champagne all night, I felt all right. I wouldn't want to go and sort of climb a mountain or anything, but I could take my daughter to school, get a bit of work done. It was fine.
Even though the world is going to shit generally, I just get very depressed about the future, and I do ask myself, as perhaps you do being a parent, what kind of world have we brought our children into? But one of the very few good things to have happened in our lifetime, I think, is the growth of artisanal gin.
Yes.
I think it's fantastic, isn't it? Now, how did that happen? Do you know?
Well, I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but the catalyst for people getting interested in gin again was Bombay Sapphire, which I think was launched in 1987. And before that, all the big spirit companies thought that gin was very boring, declining market, just leave them to it. And they didn't put any kind of marketing spend behind it. And then Bombay Sapphire came along and sort of reinvented it. Even though it's not the most exciting gin, it was
pretty good.
It was good.
And it's got a blue bottle, for goodness sake.
It's got a blue bottle.
Blue square bottle.
And they put lots of... And actually, they do a strong one, a 47% one, which is actually really, really good.
Right.
A sort of martini.
Is it better?
But it's got more alcohol.
Sorry,
it's one better.
Yes. It goes up to 11.
Yes. So that was the sort of catalyst. But then I also think that people just started becoming more interested in kind of doing things themselves, craft brewing and making your own gin and that sort of stuff. I'm not quite sure why suddenly that happened. Maybe it's to do with the internet. People could read about how to do it.
Is it a hard process to make gin? I mean, if I wanted to make Delingpole, the gin,
to be honest, I really don't think it's that difficult. You buy the spirit. So
do you?
You don't make your own. Most of them don't make their own spirit.
Do they not? Okay, yeah.
Almost all of them buy in grain spirit, which is a sort of which I don't think costs very much. And then there's lots of different ways to do it, but you put it in another still, and then you have a sort of basket with stuff in, lemon peel and things like that, and then you just
the aromatics,
and then you just redistill it through all of that. And then you kind of learn that some things work better at different temperatures, some become a bit bitter, and just trial and error. But the basics are not complicated.
So we could make this happen, couldn't we?
You could make it happen. Is
Delingpole a good name for a gin? Not really.
No, and I think that sadly the gin market is now saturated.
Is it?
I think there's too many, and I think some of them will go out of business soon. So your Sip Smiths and your Brighton gins and things, the ones that have got a really good image and very good gin, they'll last.
Are you saying I haven't got a good image?
No, I think launching a new gin now would be mad.
Yeah, okay. So which is your favourite gin of all the artisanal?
I really like Brighton gin, which has got a really strong sort of orange peel, sort of marmalade.
Isn't it rather left wing there? Rather eco.
It's actually Johnny Ray, who is the Spectator's wine man.
Oh, is
he?
He
is one of the people involved. So obviously, it's pretty lefty, being in Brighton, but there is some good, kind of solid, spectatorness there.
Yeah.
Who else? The other gins. Sip Smith is very nice. Sacred.
Now what about the one that's really expensive? As in a mainstream brand, what's it called? It's about 40 quid a bottle, and I'm wondering whether it's
Tanqueray?
No, not above Tanqueray. Americans go for it madly.
I don't know.
It'll come back to me. You've actually blasted my memory with this.
Oh right,
TFF.
It's all going to go downhill from now.
But Gin Lane, it started then, didn't it? That was the first gin craze.
Yes.
In the Hogarth's era, which was when early
18th century, sort of 1730, 1740.
So there was how did that happen? Why did everyone go mad for gin?
Well, there's a sort of a direct, because a lot of what the book's about is the sort of the law of unintended consequences. So it's like there'll be a war or a tax, and it'll lead to the creation of a drink. And this happened around 1688 when William of Orange came to the throne. And in order to raise money, he deregulated distilling. So before, it used to have the worshipful company of distillers, and only they were allowed to distill. So he let all these people distill, and this was very good for his cronies in the Houses of Parliament, because they were landowners who wanted to sell excess grain. There'd been some good harvests. So there was this sort of kind of, I hate to use the term perfect storm, but I will use the term perfect storm. So deregulation of...
You just used it, yeah.
Deregulation of distilling, lots of good harvests, and it led to people just making gin.
Was it also because William of Orange was Dutch and gin was Dutch?
Yes. So I think gin probably had come in before him, but obviously it became more popular with him because there were lots of Dutch people around. There were lots of sort of Dutch mercenaries and economists and things like that. So they made gin very popular. It led to gin being cheaper than beer, and you had lots of people, especially around kind of Covent Garden, St Giles's, that sort of area, who were living in desperate poverty, and gin was a good escape. It was the drug of the day.
So people were just using it as a form of quick escape.
Yeah. It was a way of getting out of their minds.
Because I can imagine that if you weren't a toff in those days, life must have been pretty grim.
Yeah, I think it was.
You need your escape. It's a bit like people in Scotland today, isn't it? On the
Bucky,
on the Bucky, on
the
housing projects.
Yeah.
They either take heroin, or eat deep fried Mars bars soaked with heroin, or
they're on the Bucky, or all three at once. Yeah. No, it's always been wherever you have that sort of poverty, you want people to have an escape. But then the upper classes drank a hell of a lot then as well.
Did they?
Yeah.
Was gin the toff drink?
No, they drank port.
Right.
Or brandy, or
they must have had the most colossal hangovers in those days.
I think they must have spent almost their whole lives either hungover or drunk, and they would have, and then they would have all had gout and stuff, and gallstones, and they must have they were probably in a lot of pain the whole time, not just existential pain, but actual physical pain.
Have you read Boswell's diaries?
Some of them I haven't read.
Because Boswell, he bears out your theory that he is constantly nursing the most monumental hangovers, and also they've got the problem of the clap, or they've either got syphilis or gonorrhea or both.
Yeah.
Which I think you could not but get in those days because they had nothing by way of condoms, or probably condoms as they would have been pronounced in those days, and obviously they didn't have a sort of situation where you could sleep with women of your class because that would have to be after marriage. So they ended up going whoring, and I think they all had the clap, they all had gout, they all had hangovers. So it can't have been that much fun.
No, I mean, it does. In retrospect, it does seem like a lot of fun when you read their sort of diaries and things. But yeah, or a bit earlier. Have you read Pepys's diaries? He had a gallstone, and they
Oh my God, yes.
and they trussed him up like a turkey, and then inserted like a sort of thing under his testicles, like between his, and sort of went into his stomach, and then kind of grabbed this stone and pulled it out, and he survived, and went on to sort of do, finish his diary and, sleep with the maid and stuff.
Yeah.
I would have just died.
We'd all have been very heavily on gin.
Yeah.
So probably the entire 18th century was like a 3-martini lunch after breakfast from there on.
Yeah, no, it was absolute chaos, and the sort of ordinary beer, porter, was 9%.
So we've established that everyone was drunk in the 18th century, and probably before that. I mean, Merry England.
Yes, Merry England.
Drunk then.
I think drinks became stronger in the 18th century. So not just you had sort of port, which was fortified with brandy. So before that, people would have drunk claret or sherry, but we wouldn't have been as strong. Whereas port was sort of 17, 18%, and then the London beer was porter, which would have been 7 or 8%. And that's what the working men of London would have drunk. But then you've also had small beer, which was 1 or 2%, which people would have drunk in the mornings.
Right.
To just warm themselves up for a day's drinking.
But isn't one of the reasons that more people didn't get cholera the fact that there was a sort of alcohol content in? Didn't the alcohol kind of kill off a lot of the diseases that would otherwise have bred in the water supply?
Oh yes, I mean drinking alcohol would have been a lot safer than drinking tap water, or not that there was tap water.
No.
But drinking water from the Thames or the Fleet or any of the rivers would have been extremely dangerous.
So what I'm saying to you is that weren't people before 1800 permanently pissed for their safety's sake, even children, I imagine?
I think there was definitely a kind of you would definitely have been slightly
tipsy. So pissed. I'm using that in the English sense.
They wouldn't have been angry, no.
Not angry in the American.
They would have been pissed off. I think quite a lot of them because of the syphilis and the gout and the gallstones and things.
Yeah, we're not being very good advertisements for the joys of the past, are we? I think probably things have got better. So, 18th century gin lane. Then you get to the Victorian era of. I was fascinated by this gin palaces. Tell me what a gin palace is.
A gin palace was the sort of Las Vegas casino of the sort of early to mid 19th century. So it would have been a place designed to relieve you of your money. At a time when most places didn't have gas lighting or heating, they would have had gas lights, heating, etched glass. They would have looked magnificent. If you ever go to pubs like the Viaduct in the city, or the Princess Louise in Holborn, or the Red Lion just off Jermyn Street, with all the sort of etched glass and carved wood. That's sort of what a 19th century gin palace would have looked like. They'd have looked magnificent, but they were purely designed so it was much nicer to be in one of those than to be at home. So you'd have gone in there and drunk gin.
And what you'd have seen reflections within reflections within reflections, and it would all have got a bit.
It's pretty all a bit trippy, yeah.
A bit trippy, yes, yeah. Exactly, like a sort of one of those 1960s movies with the sort of, like the trip sequence with the mirror balls and the kind of hallucinations and.
Yeah, exactly. It would have been quite strange. And then a lot of the gin may well have contained methanol as well, which is highly toxic. So yeah, you could have just been absolutely.
Is methanol the same thing as you get in Wormwood, absinthe, or is that different?
No. Methanol is when it's the alcohol that comes off. I think, let me get this right, it's the alcohol that comes off first when you're distilling, which you
like extra virgin alcohol.
Exactly, which you're meant to discard, and then so you just have ethanol, whereas methanol is toxic.
Is that the bollocks?
It makes you go blind probably and kills you. So I suppose it's quite an edgy one.
I was very proud, I think is probably the word, when I read in your book that throughout the world the British were known as complete tipplers, and one of the first things they did when they expanded the empire was to establish a local boozer and adapt the local ingredients to making the booze.
Exactly, yeah. Now, there's a wonderful quote, which I'll probably get wrong now, but it's from a Mughal emperor who thought that the British might be an entirely different species because of the amount that they drank. He said something like, as fish are born in the element of water, so they are born in the element of wine. So they actually thought the Indians, when the British came along, they were just like, wow, these people drink. They thought they might be a different species. They thought they might actually need alcohol to survive.
Well, perhaps that's true.
Well, I think that's one of the things I wanted to try and get to the bottom of in the book, and I don't think I do succeed. Which is, what is it with the British and drink? Why do we like it so much? And do we drink more than other countries? I don't think I ever quite got to the bottom of why. Though I think the climate probably has something to do with it. Having a sort of a damp, cold, unpleasant climate, I think, turns people to drink.
But then, if you look at the international league tables, we're not the top, are we? The Nordic countries and the Russians tend to be.
Well, this is the thing: is that the British actually don't drink that much, but when we do, I think we make a lot of noise about it. Not necessarily going out and literally making a lot of noise, but we write about it. We create all them. Because one of the interesting things, if you think of the Nordic countries that are famous for drinking, or the Russians who are famous for drinking, you associate them with one drink. It's schnapps or something with the Danes and the Swedes. With the Russians, it's vodka. And if you go around the sort of former Russian Empire, the Russian love of vodka kind of not quite stamped out, but did rather take over countries that previously had drunk wine or brandy or that kind of thing. So if you go to Armenia nowadays, the old people all drink vodka, even though Armenia is traditionally a wine-drinking country because of the Russian occupation. Whereas with the British, the influence was the opposite. It led to a huge diversity of drinks. So we'd go to a local country and we would take their local drink and then commercialise it, rather than stamping our own drinks on the local palate.
So rum, for example, we invented that to go with the Caribbean sugar plantations.
Well, rum was something that had been made ever since people started planting sugarcane, and most of the time it would have been absolutely revolting. It would have been like, have you ever had like really bad cachaça? It's got that kind of Brazilian rum.
I don't even know what cachaça is.
It's Brazilian rum, and it kind of smells like a sort of sulphurous jungle hell.
Right.
It's really
it
kind of rotting vegetation and stuff. That's what most rum would have been like, and it would have just been given to the poor, slaves, that kind of stuff. So your Portuguese, Spanish, or French plantation owner or Dutch would have drunk imported alcohol, and there was actually sort of laws saying that the sort of like, say, a Portuguese landowner in Brazil or somewhere wasn't allowed to make drink and sell it commercially to the Portuguese. He had to buy drink from the mother country. Whereas in England, there weren't any laws saying that. So the plantation owners in Jamaica started turning rum into something sophisticated, rather than just a drink to give to the slaves. They started trying to make it like brandy or whiskey or that kind of stuff. So the other countries were trying to protect their native alcohol markets, so they wouldn't let their colonies make commercial booze.
So free trade.
Free trade, exactly.
Which is why we're great and the other countries are kind of also mad.
Yes, well, the Dutch were sort of free tradey as well, but not quite so much. And also they have a land border with France, which is always
very unfortunate.
Always a dangerous
very
one.
Unfortunate. And the French, I imagine, get very upset by the fact that we made their vineyards great, didn't we? I mean, the reason that so much fuss is made about claret is because we taught them how to make it.
Well, it's not quite we taught them, it's just that we were their best customer. Right. Well, Britain was so much wealthier than any other country. Compared with France, the sort of London was just incredibly wealthy, and Bordeaux was the easiest place one of the easiest places to ship wine to England from. It's right on the coast of France. So a lot of places that became famous for wine, it's sort of accident of geography. And of course, Bordeaux used to be part of England as well until 1452, I think, the Battle of Castillon. So there's a sort of an old alliance between the Gascons, Gascony, and the English, because they used to be one country, and that persisted until the Napoleonic Wars, when Wellington's army came up through France. The mayor of Bordeaux, who was a chap called Mr. Lynch, originally an Irishman.
Oh, Mr. Lanchbag.
Mr. from Lanchbag, yes. He Lunch bags.
Yeah.
He came out with the keys to the city and handed them over because their best customers had arrived. So there's always been this connection between the Bordelais and the English. So the Bordelais are far closer to the English commercially and culturally than, say, the Parisians.
So is it all it's cracked up to be? Claret, the best, the Grand Cru clarets is Chateau Petrus that.
Do you know, sadly I've never had Petrus. I've had 96 Mouton Rothschild, which was just gorgeous. One of the best wines I've ever had.
Right.
And you don't need to spend. I mean, that was, I don't know how much that would be nowadays. £500 a bottle. But you get a Lynch barge, like a 2004 Lynch barge. You could probably pick up a bottle for 60 quid, and it'll be almost certainly one of the best bottles of wine you ever have.
How much is the minimum one needs to pay to get wine that's just not meh? So I get so disappointed with wine generally.
I'd say about, well, you can. I don't know if we're allowed to plug certain people. Are we?
No one cares. So no.
Yeah, the Wine Society do excellent wine for £9-10 a bottle, and if you buy a bottle with them for £15, it'll almost certainly be excellent.
Right, but seriously, because I really am.
Yeah, and you buy from places like the Southern Rhone, so you get like an upmarket Côte du Rhône or a Gigondas, which is a bit like a Châteauneuf de Pape, or something good from the Languedoc or Southern Italy. You can get some stonkingly good wines for £15.
I see. Right. I'm going to make a break here because I have to send little sound files rather than big ones. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole. After that completely natural and unforced break in the programme, and we're talking to Henry Jeffries. More in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlowe.
Paul in Connecticut, welcome to the show.
And I'm tired of banging my head against the wall, and every time you turn around, there's somebody else picking your pocket. It's insurance, it's taxes, it's regulations. I'm so sick of it. All they do is they hammer the people that want to get out there and do something every day, and they reward the people that stay home and do nothing. I'm beyond done with it. I've had it.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Henry Jeffries. Now look, the reason that we had that really crap end to the last section is not because I'm that pissed, but because I feel slightly awkward because we're in the office of the editor of The Spectator, and he's just come back from lunch. Here he is, yeah, he's coming in now, and I feel rather embarrassed to be like using his space.
Yes, no, he's probably got important things to do.
Yeah, he's got important shit to do, and here we are, just like
he's probably got Theresa May waiting on the phone.
Well, we're just shitposting basically. We're shitposting about alcohol.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that about success and stuff. How can you tell whether somebody's successful or not? Because I mean, I think you're quite successful in that you've managed to find yourself a job, which basically involves going around, getting drunk.
Yep. That would be fair.
Being paid to drink.
I get paid to drink. Yeah.
And do you have a palate?
I've got quite a good palate. I don't think I've got one of those. Give me any wine blindfolded, and I'll be able to tell you what it is. I think you need a better memory. I don't think my memory is quite all there. But no, I've got a pretty good palate.
How can you tell?
Well, I can recognise wine, so I can sort of try a wine and think that's probably this, probably
right.
That. But not with any degree of exactitude.
So if it were a Roald Dahl short story, you would not come to whatever the result of the wine tasting.
Yeah, it
thing
was a
is.
Saint Julien, I think, was the result. Yeah,
And what did you bet on? I've forgotten how it went.
his daughter,
Get right.
his daughter, like and everything else, and then it turned out that he was cheating.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to ask you a question which isn't in your book, and I've often wondered this, and you might not know the answer to it. The Romans. If we went back in time and went to a banquet held by someone like Lucullus,
Trimalchio.
Trimalchio, one of those very rich, sophisticated Romans, would the wine have been really shit? Would it have been even recognisable to the wines we drink today?
It probably would have been a lot closer to vermouth or vermouth. I never.
No, I think vermouth is the sort of gay or poncy version, and vermouth is the proper kind of English.
I think Americans say vermouth. I do spend
right.
a lot of time with Americans. It would have been a lot like vermouth. It would have had like herbs and spices in. It would have had honey and that kind of stuff. The Greek wine Retsina, which was the pine was in there to preserve it. So they would have put stuff in, A, to preserve it, and B, to disguise the fact that it was a bit ropey.
And they couldn't really have aged it, could they?
Well, they did. They used to. There are all these stories about Falernian. What is it called? Falernian. It was this famous wine from Campania, near Naples. It was meant to last like hundreds of years. And you used to hear stories about people getting out their old vintages of Falernian. And people are going to write in and say that I pronounced it wrong. But that probably would have been. It would have had like stuff added to it to preserve it, herbs and sort of spices and hops or whatever. And then it would have had mistela added to it, which is like cooked grape must, like sugar stuff, to preserve it. So almost like a sort of jam. And then it would have been sealed in amphora with beeswax, and then they would open it, and it probably would have tasted revolting.
There's probably been a lot of batch variation as well. All sorts of.
So it wouldn't have been anything. It wouldn't have been like having a nice a Lynch barge or something. It would have been pretty awful.
The other thing I've noticed is that if you read Homer, if you read the Odyssey or whatever, what you find is that they're really into the ancient Greeks. Now we've gone back even further in time from the Romans. They're really into their mixing bowls.
Yeah.
One of the key possessions in any aristocratic household is these mixing bowls on three legs, and there's obviously some sort of great ritual that goes into mixing the wine with the water, which suggests to me that they must have been drinking the wine equivalent of small beer, very low alcohol content. So they must have had to go to the loo an awful lot during the night's drinking.
During their symposium.
Yeah.
Do you think they were all like, Plato, get on with it?
This would have been way pre Plato when you think about it.
Well, the wine that they would have drunk would have been quite similar to something like a sweet Madeira. So it would have been like, you can get wine from the Greek islands, like Malvasia, which is quite sweet, quite high alcohol. And they would have, the ancient Greeks would have watered it down. Otherwise, it would have been, you'd have got hammered.
Yeah, but isn't that rather the point?
Perhaps not if you're a Greek warrior and you have to go and fight.
It seems to me that their feast days went on for a jolly long time, so maybe they needed that weak alcohol to, otherwise they'd have all just collapsed straight away, wouldn't they?
Yeah. I don't really know exactly what the ancient Greeks used to drink. I'm sure someone has done.
So, but this is the kind of question that, obviously, were you part of my entourage of experts? That's the kind of question.
Yeah, and I would have failed. I would have failed for not knowing exactly what it was.
You'd say, Mr. Delingpole, sir, I will go and find out. Well, actually, I might be quite informal with you. You might not have to call me Mr. Delingpole, sir. You might have to call. I might even call me James.
Okay.
So, which ones haven't we covered? I know you've got a relative in the whiskey business.
Yeah, Uncle Charlie Smith, who used to work for Diageo, one of the big boys.
Yeah. Dude, whiskey, I only drink it when I'm ill.
It's a good one when you're ill.
It is good, isn't it? I mean, somebody once told me that their cure for a cold is to retire to bed with, what is it, 1 bottle of whiskey, 3 bottles of whiskey, I forget, and just keep drinking it until you collapse, and then...
I used to do that, actually, when I was a lot younger. I used to think that you could kind of drink your colds away.
Are you saying you can't?
well, it doesn't work anymore. Maybe it's because I have to sort of, have a child and take it to school and things like that. When you turn up like stinking drunk, the local mothers don't really like it.
But whiskey, is it good for anything other than drinking when you go cold?
No. I mean, yes. I love whiskey. I think apart from the fact that it gives me a terrible hangover, I think whiskey is wonderful. And whiskey so sort of, especially Scotch whiskey, has such an interesting history because it used to be made by sort of Highlanders and stuff, and they would it was a sort of Scottish speciality and thought much too strong tasting for the English. And with phylloxera, which was this little bug that ate the vines in France, it came over from America. There was a brandy shortage in the gentlemen's clubs of St James's, and so they turned to Scotch, and the Scotch blended special whiskies for the English palate. So rather than having something like Lefroy, which tastes really strong, what they would do is they'd blend a few different whiskies together with a very light lowland whiskey to create something sort of sweet and gentle and fruity, but interesting. So that's where things like Johnny Walker and Bell's and Chivas Regal come from. They were designed for the English. They were designed for the Sassenachs.
Is it bad of me that actually I've had some lowland single malts, the very pale ones?
Yeah, Glenkinchie is.
And actually I rather like them. Is that bad? Does that mean I'm like a peasant or like unsophisticated when whiskey?
No, it means you have a very kind of unmacho and open-minded approach to whiskey, because most men, they sort of go, oh, it's got to be Lefroy.
They do. There is that machismo about it.
And saying you like Glenkinchie amongst some whiskey things, people would be a bit, but actually it's a very nice whiskey, and it doesn't really matter. I mean, I really like blended whiskey. I really like Johnny Walker Black Label.
Is that allowed?
I love it. I just think it's just so delicious, and it always makes me feel like I'm a sort of prosperous Lebanese businessman or something like that. In Beirut in the 60s.
That's true. They do. They love their Johnny Walker. Which is the one they go for? Is it black or is
well, blue is if you're posh, but Black Label is a kind of currency in the Middle East. You used to hear stories that you'd be sort of on the board with Jordan and your papers weren't quite right, and you'd produce a bottle of Black Label, and they would just, the gates would open.
Well, did you not mention that in your book, that not Middle East, but when you went to Portugal as a child, your family used to bribe the owner of the local hotel?
Yes, with a bottle of Johnny Alessandro. He used to let us use the pool and the golf course in return for a bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label.
And similarly, I remember when I went overland through Africa in my gap year in 1984, and one took bottles of whiskey either to bribe border guards or to sell for inflated sums. I mean, in Khartoum in 1984, you could sell a bottle of whiskey for $50. In fact, I did. I sold it to some local, because of this Sharia law had just come in, and it naturally commanded a premium price. $50 in 1984 was actually worth
a lot of money.
Worth something.
Gosh, you wouldn't want to go to Khartoum now, would you?
Well, you'd be. Well, it was. Do you know what? Even then, in the month before I arrived, the German club had been bombed by Islamists. It's 1984, and there was a civil war going on at the time, and I think a bomb had been dropped from an airplane over the side, as sort of World War I style, near Khartoum when we came in. So even then, it was just starting to get complicated. I didn't want to go here actually, but I think it is a depressing thought that here we are celebrating alcohol and stuff, and I was reminded only the other day of the fragility of the relationship between the West and the Islamic world, with that chap, that Muslim who went and upturned a whole load of wine in Paris last week.
Right. I didn't know about that.
Saying, how dare you drink this stuff during Ramadan? And I wonder whether there used to be a kind of a tolerance.
Well, it's really interesting you said that, because I went to the Wines of Turkey tasting last year, and Turkey is just starting to make some really, really good wines, and you have like international investment, and you have Californian winemakers, and they have a huge array of very interesting indigenous grapes, and it should be sort of boom time. But the pressure on them from the Islamist government is just extraordinary. Like, they're not allowed websites, they're not allowed to market any of their products internally. The local basketball team, who used to be named after Efes Pilsner, the Turkish beer, had to change the name of the team so it doesn't sound like they were called something like Efes All Stars. Yeah. And they've had to change it to, Ankara All Stars or something. Yeah. So, and they're just, I remember going to a Turkish wine tasting like 4 years ago, and the atmosphere was huge excitement that they were finally making world-class wines. And then the one last year was just nervous, and people just didn't really want to talk to me because I was asking them questions about how, or they'd give me a quote and then say, please don't quote me on that.
That is, and I imagine the same applies to Chateau Muzar in Lebanon? Or?
Well, Lebanon's a bit different because they have a really sort of strange, ramshackle political system that just about kind of works, where you have a certain number of seats for Sunni, a certain number for Shia, and a certain for Maronites. So they kind of, there's a sort of equilibrium there. So there isn't actually that much pressure on the wine producers. Though at one time the Minister of Agriculture was Hezbollah, which I don't think is very good for the wine producers, but apparently he's now a Christian. So things are looking up a bit.
Ah.
But Lebanon's actually very inspiring because it sort of feels like everybody in Lebanon is actually really sick of fighting each other, and it sort of feels almost stable.
Well, I think that I'm getting nervous about the office.
About Fraser?
Yeah, well, just slightly, I think, by the way, this is adding kind of realism to the programme. I think people sometimes like a bit of reality intruding.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to call it quits there, and we're going to... Henry, you were a fantastic guest, and thank you for lightening the mood, apart from the depressing bit at the end where we talked about Islam destroying the Turkish.
But I think we ended on a hopeful note with Lebanon.
Hopeful-ish, yes, yeah. we did. We did the hopeful bit, and that's where we're going to end. So thank you. And your book is called again, remind me?
Empire of Booze, British History Through the Bottom of the Glass.
And it really is good. Thank you, lovely friend, for listening. Bye-bye.